Hello friends, today I have recommendations for nonfiction art-related books to show you. I have 21 books on my list, so do feel free to use the timestamps to find your way around if you'd like. I'm going to cover history and general nonfiction. I have memoirs, biography, and also some criticism books. And in terms of different kinds of art, there's definitely lots of visual art, but also culinary arts, literature, general creativity / inspiration, film, and also music. And for the month of September, there's a readathon for art-related books going on, and you only have to read one book to participate, so maybe this will inspire you to read an art-related book this month. But obviously, you can and should read these kinds of books anytime. So let's get right into it. I'm going to start with the history / general nonfiction. I have 7 books to talk to you about, and the first one is an art history book, and it is The Story of Art by E.H. Gombrich. And this book has a really great reputation. This is not the book that we read when I was in art school, but I love art history and I would love to read about art history again, refamiliarize myself, learn new things, and this is the book that I will be doing that with. But this seems like a really great introduction to art history because it's written for a general audience. You don't have to know anything about art to read this. And I actually read the introduction, and it's in a very conversational kind of style, very accessible, easy to read. Renowned not only as the best concise introduction to art history, but also as a classic of art history literature, this book reflects the vast knowledge, insights, and expertise of one of this century's greatest art historians and thinkers. Extensively illustrated, it treats the history of art, both chronologically and geographically, as a continuous unfolding story, offers a vivid, enthusiastic, and interpretive narrative written in direct, straightforward language with technical terms always explained when they are introduced, focuses on the most significant works of Western art, considers each work of art in its context, shows how art reflects the historical setting, the artist's intentions, and the values of that civilization, and how each artist built upon or sometimes reacted against the styles of his or her predecessors. Contains chronological charts, maps, and notes on art books. Illustrates all works that are discussed. Features a new design with each illustration appearing on the same spread as the narrative that discusses it. So yeah, I'm very excited to get to this one and just kind of experience it over time and take my time with it. The only thing with a book like this is that still in its latest edition, it is vastly made up of male artists. It is definitely missing a lot of female artists. And so the next book is a supplement or something to maybe experience on its own, really. And it's The Story of Art Without Men by Katy Hessel. And this is exactly that. This is like The Story of Art, but featuring women artists. And I found it very interesting that the author in this, in the introduction, talks about how she graduated from art school and she really felt like she did not know women artists in history. And so she set about putting together this book to make up for that, which is very, very cool. It is vastly made up of 20th century forward artists, which is very cool to document that. But I will say, if you are very interested in pre-20th century artists, that is the smallest section in this. I wish there was more, but I've already started looking through it and I'm really enjoying it. I actually did learn about some of the women artists in this when I was in art school, which I'm very happy about to see them in here. But then there's other ones that I didn't know about. Many of them, so that's really great. And especially with so many of the modern artists in here, that's great for me too. Discover the glittering Sophonisba Anguissola of the Renaissance, the radical work of Harriet Powers in the 19th century USA, and the artists who really invented the ready-made. Explore the Dutch Golden Age, the astonishing work of post-World War artists in Latin America, and the women artists defining art in the 2020s. Have your sense of art history overturned and your eyes open to many art forms often overlooked or dismissed. From the Cornish coast to Manhattan, Nigeria to Japan, this is the history of art as it's never been told before. And so that's something else that I was very excited about with this one, is how it mentions so many different countries. And it really expands out from just the typical sort of painting and sculptures that you'll often find in history books. It talks about all kinds of different art forms, and I'm really excited to see more of that as well. So yes, if you are interested in learning about more women artists, this is, I think, definitely a book to look into. And it's a very recent release. I think it came out last year. The next book is A Face to the World on Self-Portraits by Laura Cumming. And so you might recognize the author of this one because she wrote Thunderclap, which has been very buzzy lately. But this is one of her other books that is all about self-portraits, which I think is very interesting because I love drawing portraits myself. But interestingly, not necessarily self-portraits, but I feel like self-portraits are such an interesting thing to explore in a book because there's so much about what the artist wants to communicate, how they want to be viewed, and how they want to represent themselves. So the blurb says, focusing on the art of self-portraiture, this effortlessly engaging exploration of the lives of artists sheds fascinating light on some of the most extraordinary portraits in art history. Self-portraits catch your eye. They seem to do it deliberately. Walk into any art gallery and they draw attention to themselves. Come across them in the world's museums and you get a strange shock of recognition, rather like glimpsing your own reflection. For in picturing themselves, artists reveal something far deeper than their own physical looks, the truth about how they hope to be viewed by the world, and how they wish to see themselves. Laura Cumming, art critic of The Observer, investigates the drama of the self-portrait, from Dürer, Rembrandt, and Velazquez to Munch, Picasso, Warhol, and the present day. She considers how and why self-portraits look as they do and what they reveal about the artist's innermost sense of self, as well as the curious ways in which they may imitate our behavior in real life. Drawing on art, literature, history, philosophy, and biography to examine the creative process in an entirely fresh way, Cumming offers a riveting insight into the intimate truths and elaborate fictions of self-portraiture and the lives of those who practice it. So I'm really excited to read more books by Laura Cumming, and Thunderclap was actually one of my favorite books of last year, and I featured that book in one of my other art-related videos. That one was specifically for books that I have already read and really loved and wanted to recommend, and so I am gonna link that video in case you haven't seen it. But yes, so I would love to read more books by her because I really enjoyed her writing. Next, I have a natural history book, and it is Color, A Natural History of the Palette by Victoria Finlay. And so this one talks specifically about pigments and sourcing pigments that were used in paints and dyes in the past. And you might think that could be boring, but it's actually really not. It sounds super fun. In this vivid and captivating journey through the colors of an artist's palette, Victoria Finlay takes us on an enthralling adventure around the world and through the ages, illuminating how the colors we choose to value have determined the history of culture itself. How did the most pressure-colored blue travel all the way from remote lapis mines in Afghanistan to Michelangelo's brush? What is the connection between brown paint and ancient Egyptian mummies? Why did Robin Hood wear Lincoln green? In Color, Finlay explores the physical materials that color our world, such as precious minerals and insect blood, as well as the social and political meanings that color has carried through time. So I think it sounds really fascinating and really interesting to learn about where the pigments come from and how it was that people figured out that they could use these materials in this way to begin with. This actually reminded me, there's a podcast I used to listen to a lot and I really loved. It's actually still around and I highly recommend checking it out. And it's called Stuff You Missed in History Class. And so it just talks about like really interesting historical things that are just kind of a little too random maybe to have learned in school, but super fascinating and super fun to learn about. So yes, so I recommend the podcast and the book. Next, I have a book about culinary art, and it is Invitation to a Banquet by Fuchsia Dunlop. And I am so excited about this book. I'm actually already listening to it on audio. It is narrated by the author, so I highly recommend listening to it that way. She does a really good job. And I actually featured Fuchsia's memoir in my other video that I mentioned. Because I've read that in the past and really enjoyed it. But this is a sort of history of Chinese food specifically, because Fuchsia Dunlop is a writer and cookbook author, and she is very knowledgeable of Chinese food. And so this takes 30 Chinese dishes and uses them as a sort of vehicle to talk about a lot more information to do with China, their culture, their culinary culture. So I'm going to read the blurb because it's going to help me kind of bring it all together. Chinese was the earliest truly global cuisine. When the first Chinese laborers began to settle abroad, restaurants appeared in their wake. Yet Chinese has the curious distinction of being both one of the world's best-loved culinary traditions and one of the least understood. For more than a century, the overwhelming dominance of a simplified form of Cantonese cooking ensured that few foreigners experienced anything of its richness and sophistication. But today, that is beginning to change. In Invitation to a Banquet, award-winning cook and writer Fuchsia Dunlop explores the history, philosophy, and techniques of Chinese culinary culture. In each chapter, she examines a classic dish from mapo tofu to dongpo pork, knife-scraped noodles to braised tumelopith, to reveal a distinctive aspect of Chinese gastronomy, whether it's the importance of the soybean, the lure of exotic ingredients, or the history of Buddhist vegetarian cuisine. Meeting food producers, chefs, gourmets, and home cooks as she tastes her way across the country, Fuchsia invites readers to join her in an unforgettable journey into Chinese food as it is cooked, eaten, and considered in its homeland. Weaving together history and mouth-watering descriptions of food and on-the-ground research conducted over the course of 3 decades, Invitation to a Banquet is a lively, landmark tribute to the pleasures and mysteries of Chinese cuisine. I think this is just a really great way to learn about a different culture through their food. Not so much to necessarily assimilate all of it or anything like that, but just to get a clear view from a different, a very different perspective without prejudice. And I'm really enjoying it for that. Next, I have 2 books that have to do with stolen or lost art. And the first one is The Art Thief by Michael Finkel. And it sounds really interesting. I've also seen this a lot. Every time I go into Barnes & Noble, there's so many of these books on display. But the blurb sounds really interesting. For centuries, works of art have been stolen in countless ways from all over the world. But no one has been quite as successful at it as the master thief Stefan Breitweiser. Carrying out more than 200 heists over nearly 8 years in museums and cathedrals all over Europe, Breitweiser, also with his girlfriend who worked as his lookout, stole more than 300 objects until it all fell apart in spectacular fashion. In The Art Thief, Michael Finkel brings us into Breitweiser's strange and fascinating world. Unlike most thieves, Breitweiser never stole for money. Instead, he displayed all his treasures in a pair of secret rooms where he could admire them to his heart's content. Possessed of a remarkable athleticism and an innate ability to circumvent practically any security system, Breitweiser managed to pull off a breathtaking number of audacious thefts. Yet these strange talents bred a growing disregard for risk and an addict's need to score, leading Breitweiser to ignore his girlfriend's pleas to stop, until one final act of hubris brought everything crashing down. So it sounds really fascinating, and I think it's the kind of book that really puts you into the mind of the thief, because it's narrative fiction, so it's told like a novel, so it sounds really like fun. And it's also not a very long book, so it's probably, I don't know, I imagine it's going to be very like pacey and intriguing. So yeah. And the book to do with lost art is The Vanishing Velazquez by Laura Cumming. So this is another Laura Cumming book. This one came out in 2016. And yes, it's about a lost and found, question mark, work of art. The incredible true story, part art history and part mystery, of a Velazquez painting that went missing and the obsessed 19th century bookseller determined to prove he had found it. A thrilling investigation into the complex meaning of authenticity in the unshakable determination that drives both artists and collectors of their work, The Vanishing Velazquez travels from extravagant Spanish courts in the 1700s to the gritty courtrooms and auction houses of 19th century London and New York. But it is above all a tale of mystery and detection, of tragic mishaps and mistaken identities, of class, politics, snobbery, crime, and almost farcical accident. It is a magnificently crafted page-turner, a testimony to how and why gray works of arts can affect us to the point of obsession. So again, with the whole obsession and possession. So yeah, I think this one also sounds really interesting. I'm not sure which one I'll try first of the two Laura Cumming books, but this one also sounds really interesting. And she also has another book, I think it's a memoir, but I think that one's less art related. So, but yeah, anyway, we'll see. Next, I have 4 criticism books. One is for visual arts, then I have 2 literature and 1 film. And the first book is The Art Spirit by Robert Henry. And the original subtitle for this was Notes, Articles, Fragments of Letters, and Talks to Students Bearing on the Concept and Technique of Picture Making, the Study of Art Generally, and on Appreciation. So I just think that says a lot about what the book is about. This one is about visual arts, and Robert Henry was an American painter. And I've seen some of his paintings, but I just love that he was apparently such a rebel. In this book are the essential beliefs and theories of a great teacher and American artist, Robert Henry. While it embodies the entire system of his teaching with much technical advice and critical comment for the student, it also contains inspiration for those to whom the happiness to be found through all the arts is important. No other American painter attracted such a large, intensely personal group of followers as Henry, whose death in 1929 brought to an end a life that has been completely devoted to art. He was an inspired artist and teacher who believed that everyone is vitally concerned in the happiness and wisdom to be found through the arts. Many of his paintings have been acquired by museums and private collectors. So I'm not super familiar with Robert Henry, but I've seen some of his works, and he does have a very loose painterly kind of style. You can tell that he really enjoyed the Impressionists. But I just love that he was such a rule breaker, that he was so much about going against traditional ideas of art and academic art, which tends to be very kind of rigid in its ideas of how to create art and also in assessing art. But yeah, I love the idea of hearing from an art critic who is the kind of person that believes that art really is for everybody. So that really appeals to me. Next, I have 2 literary criticism books, and the first one is A Reader's Manifesto, an attack on the growing pretentiousness in American literary prose by B.R. Myers. And I got very interested in this because it addresses that idea of pretension in literature, which I tend to be kind of skeptical when I hear someone dismiss something as pretentious, because a lot of times it feels like, you know, someone's just being dismissive because they feel intimidated by something that's challenging. But I guess I wanted to see if there was more to that, if there was a good argument here. So that's why I got interested in checking this out. And so this was first published in The Atlantic and then later turned into this book with extra commentary from reactions that the author got after it was published. And I've actually already read this. And so I do think that he has some really good points in this book. What he does is he kind of targets 3 popular authors from, I think it was the late 90s, and kind of breaks down examples from the writing to prove his point that they're just writing pretentiously without necessarily being, you know, good writers, writing good prose. And I admit that I have not read anything from these authors specifically, but in terms of what he's specifically saying about their writing, I do think that he has good points. But one of the more important arguments that I think he is talking about in the book is this idea that in the publishing industry there's a tendency to really value literary fiction more highly for the fact that it's literary fiction, not because the writing is necessarily better in itself. Because there's a lot of genre books that are also really well written, really great books that get ignored in terms of being great writing just because they're not in the literary fiction genre or category. And I do think that's a really good argument. So, but I have to say that I didn't love the tone of it. It feels very kind of gossipy and bickery, and you know, a little bit petty. And I definitely prefer a more measured, serious kind of tone personally, but I still got a lot out of it. So if it sounds interesting to you to see someone's critique of this idea of pretentious writing, then I would recommend it. Next, I have Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination by Toni Morrison. And this sounds really amazing. So it's based on 3 lectures that she gave, and the book itself is made up of 3 essays. In this, Morrison assesses major white authors like Willa Cather, Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Ernest Hemingway, tracing the way their work dealt with and was shaped by their handling of the subject of Blackness. She shows how much the themes of freedom and individualism, manhood and innocence depended on the existence of a Black population that was manifestly unfree, and that came to serve white authors as embodiments of their own fears and desires. And then there's another quote that I found interesting. In addition to this exploration of the white literary imagination, Playing in the Dark is also about a Black intellectual seizing the interpretive space within a racially ordered hierarchy of cultural criticism. Blacks are usually represented through the lens of white perception rather than the other way around. So yeah, that sounds super fascinating, and it's not a very long book, but I feel like it's just going to be packed with tons of really interesting thoughts and information to consider. The next book is Film Theory or Criticism, and it is Sculpting in Time by Andrei Tarkovsky, translated by Kitty Hunter Blair. So Tarkovsky was a Russian Soviet filmmaker, and so this book is about art and film in general, and about his films specifically. And the title Sculpting in Time refers to Tarkovsky's own sort of phrasing for his style of filmmaking. The literal translation is captured time, and his films are very intensely visual and immersive. He very much thought of film as poetry in motion, and he kind of really brings that to his films. They're definitely in the kind of art cinema. So you have very atmospheric shots, very long takes, and he often shows nature and explores themes of memory in his films. And his films are just really, really beautiful. They make me think of, if you read books that are more experimental, it's just a different way to experience a medium that you think you're very familiar with. And so it's really exciting and really fun. But this very much is meant to engage your emotions. In Sculpting in Time, Tarkovsky sets down his thoughts and his memories, revealing for the first time the original inspirations for his extraordinary films. Ivan's Childhood, Andrei Rublev, Solaris, The Mirror, Stalker, Nostalgia, and The Sacrifice. He discusses their history and his methods of work. He explores the many problems of visual creativity, and he sets forth the deeply autobiographical content of part of his oeuvre. And so what I think is really cool is that he actually ended up writing this so that he could address his audience directly and talk to them about how he thinks and how he makes his films. Because over the years, he would have people that would send him letters saying that they didn't understand his films, that they wanted to understand and feel what he was trying to express, but they just couldn't. He eventually decided to write this so that he could specifically address some of those letters that he would get and answer some of the questions in them. It's such a cool thing to be able to get, into the mind of a creative person like that and understand their thinking and their creative process and stuff. So yeah, I think this is a really cool book. So yes, I'm very interested in checking this out, and I would also very much recommend checking out his movies. They are really special within the world of film, I think. Next, I'm going to talk about memoirs, and I have 7 to share with you, but the first 2 are more memoir-ish. So the first book that I'm going to share is The Creative Gene by Hideo Kojima, and Kojima is actually a video game creator. He made the Metal Gear series, and then more recently, the video game Death Stranding, and so you might be most interested if you are a fan of his work, or at least a video game fan, but you actually don't need to know about video games at all, I think, because this book is actually a lot more about creativity and inspiration in general. Because Kojima is a huge movie buff. He also loves music. He's always posting about those things on Twitter, but he also loves books. And this book specifically is made up of very short chapters, each one about movies and books that have inspired him throughout his life. And there's actually some good quotes, I think, in the introduction that I feel like really explain where he's coming from in creating this book. He says, "My father's early death contributed to a lack of role models in my life, but inside books, I was able to find adults and teachers to guide me along. Books and movies provide only virtual experiences, but those experiences are valuable nonetheless. Of course, traveling somewhere yourself and taking in the local atmosphere would be superior. Climbing a mountain yourself would unquestionably provide a higher quality experience than listening to someone else describe climbing one. But a person can only do so much, and so there is value in sharing in another's experiences vicariously through books or film." And then he says, "Through this book, I hope to communicate the feeling of connectedness that other books have given me." So that just sounds really interesting to me because I'm familiar with his games. I haven't really played them personally. I've seen others play them, but I just appreciate the kind of creative person that he is and the fact that he loves so many different kinds of art forms. And so I think it's very interesting to learn about someone else's sort of creative mind. So that's why I included this book in this list. The next book is another memoir-ish one, and it is Faith, Hope, and Carnage by Nick Cave and Sean O'Hagan. And this is actually a very long interview done between Nick Cave and Sean O'Hagan. And the back says, "This is not a memoir, this is a conversation." But it's memoir-ish, okay? And he says, "The young Nick Cave could afford to hold the world in some form of disdain because he had no idea of what was coming down the line. I can see now that this disdain or contempt for the world was a kind of luxury or indulgence, even a vanity. He had no notion of the preciousness of life, the fragility. He had no idea how difficult, but essential, it is to love the world and to treat the world with mercy. And like I said, he had no idea what was coming down the road." So I honestly don't know too much about it, but just from that, I'm very interested. I love hearing from people who have been around the block, you know, sharing their thoughts and experiences. So you know, this really appeals to me because of that. And also, Nick Cave is just a very interesting character in general. So yeah. And if you don't know Nick Cave, he is a musician mainly, though he has also written books. The profile says he has been performing music for more than 40 years and is best known as the songwriter and lead singer of Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. Cave's body of work also covers a wider range of media and modes of expression, including film score composition, ceramic sculpture, and writing novels. I'm just very interested in hearing, you know, I guess life experiences and things like that. So yeah. Okay, we're on to the actual memoirs now, and the next book is The Art of Memoir by Mary Karr, which has been on my TBR for forever. I have wanted to read any, really, of Mary Karr's memoirs for a long time, and I still haven't. And so who knows, I might end up starting with this one, which is all about the art of memoir. Anchored by excerpts from her favorite memoirs and anecdotes from fellow writers' experience, The Art of Memoir lays bare Karr's own process. Plus, all those inside stories about how she dealt with family and friends get told, and the dark spaces in her own skull probed in depth. As she breaks down the key elements of great literary memoir, she breaks open our concepts of memory and identity and illuminates the cathartic power of reflecting on the past. Anybody with an inner life or complicated history, whether writer or reader, will relate. So I think this one isn't meant to be strictly instructional, like a manual or anything. I think it's still supposed to be a memoir. And like a memoir, it is entertaining while also being informative. So yeah, very interested in that one. Next, I have The Clearing, a memoir of art, family, and mental health by Samantha Clark. And this one is a memoir of a working artist. Samantha Clark enjoyed a busy career as an artist before returning home to Glasgow to take care of the house that her parents had left behind. Moving from room to room, sifting through the clutter of belongings, reflecting on her mother's long, sedated years of mental illness and her father's retreat to the world of amateur radio and model planes, Samantha began to contemplate her inheritance. A need for creativity and a desire for solitude had sprung up from a childhood shaped by anxiety and confusion. Weaving in the works and lives of others, including celebrated painter Agnes Martin and scientist of dark matter Vera Rubin, The Clearing is a powerful account of what we must do with the things we cannot know. So this sounds really interesting. I didn't know Samantha Clark before I found this book, but I looked up her work, and I'm gonna link it in the description if you want to check it out because it's really beautiful. The cover sort of makes me think of it. She makes these abstract paintings that really evoke nature, but use a lot of like texture and also layers of textures, like these little spots, to create very interesting art pieces. So worth checking out. And I just love that this, has that mix of art, family, and mental health. It just sounds really wonderful. I got this copy used, and you can see that it's a library copy, so it has the sticker down here. I can't take it off because it's laminated, but it's in really great condition, so I'm happy. And also, it's from a library in South Dublin, so I kind of love having that little bit of history to this particular copy. Next, I have Bound for Glory by Woody Guthrie, and this is his memoir. And he was a really important singer-songwriter in the American folk scene. He was an anti-fascist and really important figure musically and politically. He wrote the song "This Land Is Your Land," and he has inspired many singer-songwriters like Bruce Springsteen, Bob Dylan, and Johnny Cash. First published in 1943, this autobiography is also a superb portrait of America's Depression years by the folk singer, activist, and man who saw it all. Woody Guthrie was born in Oklahoma and traveled this whole country over, not by jet or motorcycle, but by boxcar, thumb, and foot. During the journey of discovery that was his life, he composed and sang words and music that have become a national heritage. His songs, however, are but part of his legacy. Behind him, Woody Guthrie left a remarkable autobiography that vividly brings to life both his vibrant personality and a vision of America we cannot afford to let die. So yeah, I know of his music and like a tiny bit about him, but I would love to read this and find out a lot more. Next, I have a memoir/essay collection called Close to the Knives, a Memoir of Disintegration by David Voyeurovich. And he was an American artist. He was a true multidisciplinarian. He did so many different things. He was a photographer, writer, filmmaker, and a really big AIDS activist as well. In Close to the Knives, David Voyeurovich gives us an important and timely document, a collection of creative essays, a scathing, sexy, sublimely humorous, and honest personal testimony to the fear of diversity in America. From the author's violent childhood in suburbia to eventual homelessness on the streets and piers of New York City, to recognition as one of the most provocative artists of his generation. Close to the Knives is his powerful and iconoclastic memoir. Street life, drugs, art and nature, family, AIDS, politics, friendship, and acceptance. Voyeurovich challenges us to examine our lives, politically, socially, emotionally, and aesthetically. So I only know a very little bit about him. I've seen some of his visual art as well, and he just seems like a really interesting and tragic figure because he died from AIDS in 92, I think, when he was only 37, I think. And he was part of the Cinema of Transgression movement in New York, and I've seen some of his short films. So I'm just very interested in finding out more about his life and his art. And we're down to the last memoir, and it is Dancing Ledge by Derek Jarman. And he was an English filmmaker, but he also worked on costume designs and stage designs. He also worked on some music videos for Suede, the Pet Shop Boys, and Patti Smith. and he was a gay rights activist, and he explored a lot of queer themes in his movies. But this book is specifically about his life and work. From his sexual awakening in post-war England to life in the 60s and beyond, Derek Jarman tells his life story with the in-your-face immediacy that became his trademark style in both his films and writing. Accompanied by many photographs of Jarman, his friends, lovers, and inspirations, the candid accounts in Dancing Ledge provide intimate and incredibly vivid glimpses into his iconoclastic filmmaker's life and times. So this is his autobiography until the age of 40. He did die from AIDS in the 90s at the age of 52. And again, I'm just very interested in learning more about him and also watching more of his films. And now I have the last 3 books, and they're all biographies. So I have one musician and 2 painters. And the first one is Becoming Ella Fitzgerald by Judith Tick. So this is a new biography of Ella Fitzgerald. And it says, a landmark biography that reclaims Ella Fitzgerald as a major American artist and modernist innovator. Ella Fitzgerald possessed one of the 20th century's most astonishing voices. In his first major biography since Fitzgerald's death, historian Judith Tick offers a sublime portrait of this ambitious risk-taker whose exceptional musical spontaneity made her a transformational artist. And yeah, I love Ella Fitzgerald's voice and her music, but I don't actually know that much about her, so I'm definitely very interested in checking out this biography. Next, I have The Grand Affair, John Singer Sargent and His World by Paul Fisher. And Sargent is my favorite artist, so I am very excited about this chunky biography of him. He is probably most well known for his really beautiful portraits, oil portraits, which he kind of famously grew very sick of later in his life and gave up on making those entirely. And then he would just travel around Europe with his mother and his sister and make watercolor plein air paintings, which I can't blame him for that. In The Grand Affair, the historian Paul Fisher offers a vivid life of the buttoned-up artist and his unbuttoned work. Sargent's nervy, edgy portraits exposed illicit or dark feelings in himself and his sitters, feelings that high society on both sides of the Atlantic found fascinating and off-putting. Fisher traces Singer's life from his wandering trans-European childhood to the salons of Paris, and the scandals and enthusiasms he caused, and on to London. There he mixed with eccentrics and aristocrats, and the likes of Henry James and Oscar Wilde, while at the same time forming a close relationship with a lightweight boxer who became his model, valet, and traveling partner. In later years, Sargent met up with his friend and patron Isabella Stewart Gardner around the world and devoted himself to a new model, the African-American elevator operator and part-time contortionist Thomas McKellar, who would become the subject of some of Sargent's most daring and powerful work. But I'm very excited about this because Sargent was known to be a very private person, so there's a lot of things about his life that are not very well known, but this feels like it's going to be very thorough. So I'm very excited about that. And the last biography, the last book on this list, is actually a graphic novel, and it is Frida, The Story of Her Life by Vanna Vinci. Blending facts and history with dreamlike and surreal sequences, Vanna Vinci creates an intimate portrayal of an artist who incorporated her life experiences into her art. Kahlo's burning love and crushing loss, her incredible joy and deep despair are all captured in boldly colored, minutely detailed illustrations, an evocative, fittingly passionate tribute to a legendary figure. And indeed, it is very beautiful. And it does have some really beautiful drawings. It does include quite a bit of nudity and some blood. It's definitely meant for adults, but it's not gory. The drawings are only as explicit as Frida's own work was at times, so very kind of stylized. And yeah, I was just very interested in this when I saw it in a bookstore quite a while ago, because it just seemed like such a cool way to explore an artist's life through art that also at times mimics that artist's work, you know, very kind of meta. So yeah, but I haven't actually read this through yet, so I need to do that soon. It wouldn't take very long either, so yeah. So those were all the books on my list. I hope you enjoyed hearing me talk about them. Let me know if you're going to be reading anything art related for Framed in September. I would love to know what it is that you'll be reading. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.